Okay, I'm going to do a little video here on trigger improvements to a Smith & Wesson M&P shield. The information that I'm going to have in here will also apply to the full-size M&P and the M&P compact, as the internals are very, very similar. I do believe even some of the parts are interchangeable. So, to begin with, gun is empty. So, on an M&P, things to note about the trigger and how to adjust it. One of the first things I have to say is that messing with a trigger on any firearm requires a skill set, proper tooling, and adequate knowledge. If you do not have all three of those, do not do any work on your trigger. You can take it to a gunsmith and let them do the work, or some pistols, like the M&P line, have aftermarket options in which you drop in parts. So if you have basic skills enough to disassemble the pistol down farther than basic field strip, then you'll be fine. The M&P is very easy to work on, so that is always an option. There are some pistols, though, that are a little bit more complicated to work on and require more skill. Always take into account your skill level and abilities, because if you mess with a trigger and do it wrong, you can damage your pistol, cause your pistol to stop functioning, or cause your pistol to become unsafe, cause the pistol to be put into a situation where a negligent discharge is more likely, where the gun will go off when you do not intend it to, due to whatever reason, drops, bumps, anything. That is bad. You need to always be 100% confident that your trigger is functioning properly and safe. So, once again, if you do not have the knowledge needed, the skills, or the tools, do not do trigger work on any pistol. So, to get started with this, I'll go ahead and disassemble and show you a few things about this. First, we will start with the frame. It's where most of the work will need to be done anyway. First, the trigger bar. This little nub right here, sticking off the trigger bar, as you can see it moves when you pull the trigger. That is what disengages the striker block. The striker block is a drop safety that prevents the striker from going all the way forward and contacting the primer and igniting it when the trigger is not pulled. That striker block on the M&P sits right here. That little silver, round silver piece is a spring-loaded plunger that moves up and down. So, that on an M&P can lead to some very clunky feeling triggers, very stagey and notchy kind of a feel on an M&P, and it can make a stagey feel on a lot of different pistols that have those kind of mechanisms. So what I did was I smoothed the face, as the rear face is what slides back over that plunger. So I had to smooth that and make sure the radius was even and didn't have any ridges. But it is always important that you do not remove material on something like this, because if you remove material, you can cause the striker block to not be lifted far enough, and that will cause the pistol to not fire when you pull the trigger. So, polishing only. And if you have to do any kind of alterations to the shape, they need to be very limited. As I said, this had just a little slight ridge right here as it met the top. All I did was smooth that down. And now, even though the trigger was pretty smooth to begin with, it is very smooth. The only thing I can feel when I pull that trigger is I can feel the spring being compressed of the plunger. I do not feel the plunger being engaged or ridden over. Only the plunger, only the spring itself. So that is an important place. Now, another place is on the trigger is this little loop right here. The trigger bar loops back like a candy cane right here. That is the part that comes back and contacts the sear and causes the sear to move. So maybe you can see it better this way. See this little loop of metal right here. That I polished. I polished that up, made it smooth, and that allows for when it engages the sear to be just smoother as it moves backwards. Also, due to that loop of metal there, you can adjust the trigger brake, where the trigger breaks on the pistol. If you close the loop tighter, the loop does not contact the sear until it gets the trigger is pulled farther to the rear. If you open it up, it hits the sear quicker. So that is another adjustment point on an M&P. Another thing I did was the sear itself usually has a rearward swept angle off the back of the sear. I smoothed that down and polished the back of the sear. You can simply polish the sear only if that is your desire, but I wanted to lower the weight and make it smoother with a little less creep, so I smoothed that down. And it's a very similar profile to the Apex aftermarket sear that you can buy that is just drop in. And so now that reduced the pull weight significantly and also smoothed things up. Also on the sear is a lobe that comes off the side of the sear, and that is what the trigger bar loop rides against and uses to push the sear and rotate the sear. I smoothed that up and did a slight profile change on it, very slight, mostly just to remove some casting marks or manufacturing marks on it, and then smoothed it up, and that makes it a very smooth thing. Another thing I do whenever I'm working triggers, I use grease on triggers on any parts, especially the parts that are sliding, and on the face of the sear that engages the striker, because that allows the grease resists shear forces better, sliding forces. And there's a lot of tension and pressure on that point on the back of that sear. So a little grease will help smooth your trigger pull a pretty good bit, all on its own. So those are points there that you need to look out for. And on the slide, I polished the forward face of the striker, smoothed it out because it was a little uneven due to the casting marks. So I polished and smoothed. I do not recommend removing material from the striker, and if you're going to mess with the sear itself, be extremely careful there, because you can make an unsafe trigger in a hurry by messing the angles up on your striker face or the sear. Those are the areas where if you overdo it, the sear will not engage properly, and it can cause a slip, and the striker can move forward when you do not intend it to. The striker block is there to help prevent these things, but you should never rely on something like that. That is a bad habit to do. As far as the striker block itself, though, to access it, you have to go through the sights on an M&P because it lifts out the top of the slide. The sights on an M&P must be drifted from the left to the right. You cannot push them the opposite way. The cuts get tighter to the left side, so it snugs as you put it in. So remember, push from the left and then install from the right. Mine comes with a little set screw, so you have to make sure you loosen that as well. But after I pushed that out, I gained access to the striker block, and then I used a buffing wheel with a very fine grit impregnated in it that allowed it to very slowly buff, polish, and remove material very slowly. And I put it on the end of a punch small enough that it would sit into the spring hole of the plunger, so it could spin freely. And then I held it at an angle just right to the buffing wheel, that as the buffing wheel was spinning, the striker block also span. So that way it was constantly rotating and it was buffing, polishing evenly all the way around. And then I just took the radius of it and just made it a more gradual and even radius, so it was easier for the striker block to be lifted by the trigger bar. And I also polished the outer edges of the striker block, so as it rode up and down in the slide, that it would be smoother as well. So those are the parts that you focus on the M&P. If, as I said, you do not have the skills or the ability, tools, whatever, you can have a gunsmith do this work, or Apex Tactical sells parts that are drop-in parts. They come in a kit. You can buy the Sear alone, but I believe they claim that just the Sear can drop the trigger pull weight too far. So they recommend you get springs from them as well that are actually stronger than the springs come from the factory, to bring your pull weight back up to an acceptable level of over 5 pounds if this is a carry gun. So keep that in mind. The kit, I believe, is about 80 bucks right now, and you can get the replacement trigger, if you so choose, from them. That is about 40 bucks. It's a solid body trigger instead of the split trigger that comes on M&Ps. I like it, but the trigger on the Shield I think is much better than the one on a full-size M&P, because the M&P is a little thinner and it feels like it flexes more and is less sturdy, and I don't feel the Shield is flimsy. So I kept the same trigger. The trigger that they provide does reduce travel, overall travel. It'll have less over travel and less take up of the trigger, and I think there's a slight angle difference, so just putting in the trigger can actually lower the pull weight just a little bit as well, due to a greater mechanical advantage. So Apex parts are definitely worth it if you don't want to have to go through the trouble of polishing and all that stuff. To do the work, all you need is one punch that can take out the forward pin and the rear pin. Those are roll pins, so you prefer a roll pin punch to a standard punch. But one punch, as both of these are the same size, you drift these out, and then the trigger also has another pin that just pushes out. The takedown lever can be wiggled and pulled out of the frame, and the inserts, the metal inserts, will lift up, and that will give you access to the parts. There are small parts inside there, so you must watch that. Some people say get a big gallon bag or one of those huge Ziploc bags, put the firearm inside of it, and then start taking things apart. That way if anything flies off, it gets trapped inside the bag. Now, the Apex kit will come with spring, a new trigger spring. It will come with a new Sear spring, a new Sear, and also it comes with a different striker block. So that was the hardest part, is the striker block, because you have to remove the sights and you can damage your finish if you're not careful. So if you're not comfortable doing that, you don't have to do the striker block. it won't be as smooth on the take up, but your pull weight will be down. So it won't be quite as good, but depending on how smooth the take up is in your pistol already, you might not need it. If you're going to be having aftermarket sights put on, do it at the same time to save yourself some hassle. A gunsmith should be able to do the part change fairly quickly as well, and it should be a minimum charge. I mean, they have tools to do it, and it'll take them 15 minutes. So that's another option. Apex sells multiple style kits. They sell competition kits, carry kit, and a carry kit, and usually they send, it's one kit with both kinds of springs. Make sure you use the correct springs. If this is a carry gun, use the carry springs. You do not need an overly light trigger on a carry gun. It's just typically not safe, because when you're in a stressful situation, you need to be sure that you're pulling the trigger and not doing it by accident due to your jumpy nature because of fear. So do that. They also have what they call their forward set Sear. I don't know if it works on the shield, but it does work on the full size and the compact. That reduces travel of the trigger a lot and brings the break point farther forward. It is a very crisp trigger. It's more akin to a single action trigger than a standard striker triggers. People carry it. It does come with springs to bring the weight over 5 pounds, about 5.5 pounds. If you're comfortable with it, you can use that for carry, but it's a lot of people say they would probably prefer their standard carry kit. And for me, the way I have mine set up, I would recommend that as well, because even with my forward set Sear having my full size, I set it up to break more closely to the standard trigger than how they have it set up as forward set Sear. But it did lower overall travel of the trigger much more than their Apex's standard kit. So there you have it. For an M&P, the work is fairly easy with a little knowledge and proper tooling. And doing part swaps on it is the easiest of all. There are instructions on how to do an Apex kit install online, many different ones. So you can watch a few different ones, maybe get different angles and different hints of how to do it. And I think most gun owners that are responsible gun owners that know how to properly handle firearms should have no problems with doing an Apex install. So that would be the option I would go with if you don't feel like you can do the work yourself. Okay, so that's it. Now you know, just make sure you do things properly and smartly. So keep in mind that doing that, always be mindful of what you're doing. I cannot stress that enough. Safety. You have to have a safe trigger, and you have to do it right. One of the things about a trigger, over travel, a lot of people try to reduce over travel or even eliminate it. I never advocate removing all over travel. I always say leave a little, because parts wear in, they start mating together, and you may find that you've eliminated over travel, but 1,000 rounds down the road, all of a sudden your trigger stops functioning because parts have mated together properly and finished mating together and wore in together, and it was enough change in the geometries to cause the trigger to not drop properly. So a little over travel after the break helps guarantee that you have a trigger that will function for a long properly, no matter what. So that's the last point I think I can make on that. And as I said, be smart when you're doing any work on a firearm.